Mormon apologists like Daniel Peterson and Kevin Barney have argued that there's a kind of link between Asherah and Heavenly Mother. By the way, this is bonkers.
All right, let's see it.
The reason why the Israelites were exiled, in part, was because of their tolerance for false gods like Asherah.
So the Judahites were exiled because the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered by the much larger Babylonian Empire. And the interpretation of that conquest as a punishment that was allowed by the Judahite patron deity Adonai is a post hoc rationalization. This is something that exilic and post-exilic authors came up with as a way to interpret this subjugation by another nation through the lenses of their heritage, which had to maintain the sovereignty over that land of their patron deity Adonai. And the interpretation of conquest as punishment by your own patron deity is actually very common in ancient Southwest Asia. In fact, we can go back to the Mesha inscription from the middle of the 9th century BCE, where the Moabite king Mesha interprets the subjugation of Moab to the Amride dynasty as a product of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh being angry with his land. So this is a very common way to interpret conquest on the part of another nation. But then you need to explain why the patron deity would be angry with their land. And this is where we bring in the concerns of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic historian. These are authors, a scribal school responsible for preserving and curating the history of ancient Israel and Judah. And under the reign of King Josiah, there was a big ideological pivot where we have the discovery in the temple of the Book of the Law, which the overwhelming majority of scholars agree was probably rhetoric associated with the composition of the earliest layers of the Book of Deuteronomy, which were actually introducing entirely novel legislation to engage in a campaign of cult centralization. In other words, to make it seem like God had always wanted worship to occur in only one cult site, with only one deity, and only one priesthood. And this served the interests of King Josiah because he was in charge of the Jerusalem temple and the Jerusalem priesthood and the worship of Adonai in Jerusalem. And so, whereas in earlier periods, nobody seems to have had any problem with worship of Asherah as the consort partner or wife of Adonai and El, the Northwest Semitic patriarchal high deity, when the cult sites around Jerusalem were destroyed by Sennacherib's invasion, there was kind of a cult centralization because none of the other cult sites were operative, and so if you wanted to worship Adonai, you had to go to the temple in Jerusalem. And the kings after Hezekiah seem to have tried to restore the earlier worship that was going on. Again, that nobody seems to have had any problem with until we get to Josiah, who, in my opinion, looks around and says, I kind of like everybody having to come here. Let's come up with some legislation that requires everybody come here. And then we have the miraculous finding of the law in the temple, which introduces this novel legislation, which says, one God, one temple, one priesthood, one city. And so the Deuteronomistic authors that are coming in later generations are then rewriting the earlier history to make it seem like what was perfectly normal in earlier periods was actually open defiance of God's law. You know, that law that King Josiah had composed during his reign. So this is all Deuteronomistic in orientation. This is about cult centralization and a campaign that was initiated during the reign of King Josiah in order to render de jure what had been up until that point a de facto cult centralization arising from Sennacherib's destruction of all the other cult sites around ancient Israel and Judah.
Mormons get really excited. We find a lot of Asherah figurines in Israelite culture. I know. That's bad. It's really bad.
So I don't think there's a good case to make for any kind of genetic relationship between the LDS doctrine of Heavenly Mother and the fact that Asherah would have been worshipped alongside Adonai as their consort partner or wife prior to the 7th century BCE. So I would agree that Mormons are getting too excited about that relationship. I don't think there's a good case to make for that. However, I also don't think there's a good case to make that the worship of Asherah alongside Adonai prior to the 7th century BCE was apostasy or was open defiance of God's laws, because we can see the rise of the condemnation and the demonization of Asherah and her worship as a direct result of the campaign of cult centralization that was undertaken during the reign of Josiah in the 7th century BCE. And we can't find any such condemnation prior to that campaign of cult centralization. All of the passages in the Hebrew Bible that condemn the worship of Asherah are Deuteronomistic in origin and orientation. There are a couple of prophetic passages that some people argue predate that campaign of cult centralization, but there are also good arguments to make that they are Deuteronomistic layers, as many scholars have argued. And if that's the case, then we have no condemnation or demonization of Asherah or her worship prior to the 7th century BCE. It seems to have been normative prior to that time period. And so the folks who are saying, well, we know they worshipped Asherah because the Bible says they did and condemns them for it. But that's all later authors looking back on earlier history and saying, hey, everything our ancestors did, they weren't supposed to be doing because we have this law. The problem is that law doesn't seem to have been around during that earlier time period. Scholars are in pretty widespread agreement that that law is a product of this campaign of cult centralization that took place in the 7th century BCE that then reinterpreted everything that happened before as open defiance of that new law. So I don't think these apologists really have a good case to make either. They can only appeal to their dogmas and count on the intended audience already agreeing with them, and so not bothering to think critically about what scholarship actually has to say about the date of the rise of the condemnation and demonization of Asherah and her worship.
Gideon tore down a pole to Asherah in the book of Judges, and his father took the blame for it, but it was a good thing that he tore it down. It was syncretism.
And it just so happens that scholars are in widespread agreement that the story in Judges 6, beginning in verse 25, of Jerubbaal or Gideon tearing down the divine images of Baal and Asherah are Deuteronomistic. They were written during the period of this campaign of cult centralization. For instance, here's a recent commentary on Judges from the Anchor Yale Bible Commentary series. The entire episode, however, is filtered through Deuteronomistic eyes, and Gideon's fault is made an excuse to judge the effectiveness of a false god. The clash that follows their demand essentially replays themes occurring when Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. We can go to Susan Neidich's Old Testament Library Commentary. This section, The Voice of the Theologian, which goes down to the second page, discusses the Deuteronomistic orientation and origins of the layers that include our passage in Judges 6. I think probably the most thorough discussion is the discussion of Mark and Elizabeth Block-Smith from their recent Hermeneia commentary on the first part of the book of Judges, under background and setting in the right column. In verses 25 through 32, Gideon's religious purpose is to combat his clan's worship of Baal. More specifically, verses 25 through 32 construct two groups in tension, two competing religio-social fields. On one side, cultic devotion to Adonai and his altar, and on the other side, Baal's altar and the Asherahs associated with him. In contrast to the Asherahs' association with Adonai in the Quintilad Ajrud inscriptions, Deuteronomy 16:21 and 1 Kings 18:19 are polemics designed in the first case to dissociate the Asherah from Adonai, and in the second instance to associate it secondarily with Baal, as suggested by Saul M. Olyan. Verses 25 through 32 comport with the representation in 1 Kings 18, yet in comparison to 1 Kings 18:19, the Asherah plays a more central role here. See verses 25b, 26b, 28b, 30b, and is thus suggestive of a Deuteronomistic or even a post-Deuteronomistic construction. rather than a secondary addition to an older version. And you can go through the other pages of this commentary to see the rest of the discussion, which situates this story within a Deuteronomistic or even a post-Deuteronomistic time periods.
And I hear that on the street all the time. Well, they'll be like, well, the Jews were essentially henotheists. That was a bad thing. And the Bible condemns it the whole time in the book of Judges. It's hard for me to grasp the logic behind it. It's like grasping on straws, essentially, because like you said, I mean, categorically condemned by God.
Right. They get really excited about Canaanite theology.
So these apologists are not even going to acknowledge, much less engage, the critical scholarship regarding the normativity of the worship of Asherah prior to the 7th century BCE. But they don't have to, because they're not performing this competence, this conviction for a scholarly audience. They're performing it for a confessional audience, an audience that already agrees with them regarding a bunch of dogmas, such as the presuppositions of inspiration and inerrancy and univocality. And so to bring up that scholarship would just be a liability, because they wouldn't really be able to perform a competent engagement with that critical scholarship absent the appeal to those presuppositions about inspiration, inerrancy, and univocality. They would just have to retreat to those dogmas anyway, and so there's no real purpose in bringing it up. Their audience already agrees with them regarding those things, and so they can just leverage those presuppositions and those dogmas to attack Mormon apologists. Now, Mormon apologists are going to do the same thing where the scholarship does not agree with their own identity politics. So this is not something unique to evangelical apologetics. It is something that we find in all apologetics. If the critical scholarship agrees with your identity politics, great, you can bring it up. When it doesn't, you either have to just entirely ignore it, or you have to try to poke holes where you can in the scholarship. Now, if you would like to learn more about Asherah and the worship of Asherah as the consort partner or wife of Adonai, here are some texts that you can check out, and I would particularly recommend William Deaver's book, Did God Have a Wife?, which is probably the most accessible of these. And the fit for this video, of course, has been Adonai and his Asherah.